welcome to the AI and Big Data in Finance webinar. We're delighted to have two distinguished speakers today. Jules van Binsbergen from the Wharton School will present his paper, Almost 200 Years of News-Based Economic Sentiment. And then after that, Baozhong Yang from Georgia State University is the discussant. Jules will have 30 minutes for the presentation. And after about 15 minutes, I will briefly check in with you to sort of give the audience a chance to sort of clarify any brief questions. And then we'll jump into the discussion for which Baozhong will take 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to the general audience for Q&A. If you have questions in the meantime, please submit them in the Q&A feature, and then I will call on you during the questioning part. And just as a reminder, please be respectful with your comments. The presentation and discussion will be recorded, and together with the slides will be posted on our website. And after the main webinar, we'll have an unrecorded discussion where we'll upgrade everyone to a panelist. So without further ado, Jules, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Andy. First of all, let me thank you and the organizers for having me today here to present this paper. This paper is together with Svetlana, Mayuk, and Varun, and Svetlana is also online here with us. And I already would like to thank Baozhong for taking the time to go over the paper and discussing it after this presentation. So the main thing we would like to go after in this paper is to think a bit more about sentiment measures as we can get them from larger text sources. So I think very little motivation will be necessary with respect to the importance of expectations and sentiment and their influence on the business cycle. And I think that several papers that are listed there have argued that there is an important connection there. And so the question is, can we improve and how would we go about measuring sentiment? And I think that there are essentially two ways of going about it. One would be to use structural models and try to back out sentiment shocks that way and try to go after sentiment that way. The other one is to use survey-based measures, such as the consumer confidence measures that are widely used. There are a couple of challenges there that we're trying to overcome through the approach that we're going to do today. One is data availability. So existing survey measures are quite short-lived and target very few objects. And then secondly, how to measure sentiment information content of the news, right? So that is a question that we're going to go after in this paper. And so what we're going to do in this paper is to construct a local and national news-based economic sentiment measure for about almost 200 years, so for 170 years. And so I think that from a data perspective, there are two benefits to the approach that we're going to take. We're going to expand to a large extent the time series, but also the cross-section. And so we'll talk a bit about what so far we've been able to extract in the cross-section. In principle, there are no limits in going further in the granularity for the cross-section. We're going to go for state level, US state level measures today. So the data that we're going to use is one of the biggest corpus of newspaper articles in the world. It's 193 million pages, 2 billion articles, about 100 times larger than the English Wikipedia database. We're then going to use a methodology that was developed by Mayuk in an earlier paper and to extract views and attitudes towards, say, in this particular case, economic news, and try to extract a series both in the time series and the cross-section for that. Now, we are going to be using word-to-vec with neural networks. One question that inevitably is going to come up is, can you not use even more advanced measures or methods like BERT or LLM? Given the size of the data that we have, at this point, it's not yet possible to use these even more advanced methods. But obviously, in the future, that may be different. And then it would be interesting to see what these more advanced metrics would extract in terms of what we're after. I will show you soon what exactly we are extracting. And so I think it's a relative straightforward thing that we're after, for which we believe word2vec will be perfectly appropriate. And so the measure that we're going to get is a state and country level measure of economic sentiment. And we are actually also going to do some work where we're going to ask the question, can we separate economic news from the overall tendency in terms of news reporting? And as you will see from the data, this is something to be taken seriously. And the reason why that is that there does seem to be trends in sentiment of reporting more generally. We are not going to be taking a particular stance on what is causing these trends in the reporting that we're seeing in terms of the positivity and the negativity, but just to already give you a little bit of a takeaway. If you look at the overall negativity of news reporting, I think that the last data point that we have in the sample is by far the most negative data point that we have over this entire 170-year period. So in other words, in the last, at the end of the 2020, we have the most negative news reporting that we've had historically in our database. And and that's just not just something that holds for economic news, but that holds for general news as well. And so that does raise the question, where does that come from? What causes those trends? And are those trends important for economic news, or should we orthogonalize these sorts of trends from the economic news that we have? And so we'll show you what influence that has. Now, another thing that I think is important to clarify immediately up front is the following. As soon as in finance and economics we talk about sentiment, then there is immediately, for most of us, this association with some sort of behavioral or non-rational expectation type of framework that we would be using. And in our particular case, we are simply going to take newspaper articles and we are going to see how positive or negative that news is. So there's still a point there where we need to separate the definition of the word sentiment purely as a word description of how positive or negative the news is, from what in economics and finance we usually mean when we talk about sentiment, meaning deviations from rational expectations. And we'll dive into that a bit in the slides. And as it turns out, it's actually quite nuanced in the sense that by looking at whether or not the sentiment measure predicts stock returns, yes or no, whether it predicts cash flows, whether or not it can beat analyst forecasts and so forth, there's going to be quite a nuanced picture of whether we're talking about expectational errors that we should think about, or exuberance, or whether we simply should think about the expectations that would arise in a rational expectations framework. Now, given the fact that expectations themselves can have a self-fulfilling prophecy, it might not even be so obvious how to separate these two things to begin with, but we'll spend some time on that as well. And so here are, so that I get all the findings in before I run out of time, because I only have 30 minutes. So first, sentiment is a clear business cycle pattern. One, we can correlate it with existing measures, even though those existing measures, of course, exist, say the Michigan survey, over a much shorter time sample. And what we find is that over the sample where the two of them overlap, we have a substantial positive correlation. Although even there are some interesting deviations that I think are worth thinking about and where those come from. But I do think that the overall high correlation with the Michigan survey lends credibility to what we're trying to measure here. Furthermore, and so I'm going to be very careful to stay away from any causal statements. I'm going to mainly describe what we do in the paper, which is to simply see whether there's predictive power here coming from this sentiment measure. And so for that, to see whether it predicts over and above other existing predictors, we don't have to take a stance on what exactly causes what. So what we find is that our sentiment measure leads the survey of professional forecasters. It predicts GDP growth, employment, consumption, and services, even controlling for past fundamentals and for past predictors that many people have used to try to predict GDP growth, say things like the yield spread. And also what we're finding is that our sentiment measure seems to have implications for forecasting the Fed funds rate. And so we are going to be talking about a Romer and Romer type Taylor rule and seeing whether or not, in addition to the information set that's generally used in those types of specifications, our sentiment measure has additional predictive power over and above those Taylor rules. And we're going to find that particularly on the downside, it seems to have that additional predictive power. Again, we're going to have quite a nuanced discussion about what that means and how we should think about causality. Again, we are going to be very careful to try to stay away from causality as much as we can, simply because it's an extraordinarily complicated issue, a hairy issue to try to disentangle these things. Now, one unique feature that our data has is that we can also look at sentiment measures at the state level. And I think that arguably the most interesting and surprising thing in my mind that comes out of that is that there's very large sectional heterogeneity in sentiment, meaning that, yes, there is a national up and down related to business cycle pattern that we're seeing, but around that common pattern, there's a lot of cross-sectional variation that is interesting, to the extent that only 35% of the variation of state level sentiment comes from the aggregate. This is from this common trend. And so and in the paper we look at a couple of examples where we say, well, if you think, for example, about the dot-com boom busting, so where would we expect that to have an influence on sentiment? Is that more of a California thing? Is that more of a New York thing? Or if you think, for example, about the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, we're finding more that that's more of an East Coast New York thing rather than a California thing, whereas the dot-com boom busting was more of a California thing. So there seems to be this different influence of different events related to sentiment in different states. Finally, one thing that is interesting is that the dispersion in sentiment seems to be bad news for GDP growth going forward. So if we see that in certain states sentiment's very high, while in others it's very low, and the dispersion is higher than usual, that seems to have a negative predictive implication for GDP growth going forward. Again, no causal statement, simply a predictive statement that we have here. All right, so we have newspaper coverage across the states. So as we said, one of the nice things that we have is that we have local newspapers. So it's not so much the national newspapers, of which of course there are a few, but in addition to the national newspapers, there are many, many more local newspapers. And they may also to some extent cover national news, but obviously they also cover local news that don't make it into the national newspapers. There is one thing to discuss at the end, though, that this has implications for, which is obviously, if we go to the very beginning of our sample 170 years ago, and you can imagine that a local newspaper was very important for the news in that particular area at that point in time, and that the role of national news was much less important. When you get to the end of our sample, as you can imagine, there are many other different news sources available. And particularly if we wanted to expand our analysis going forward, say for the next 100 years, then the question, of course, is whether newspapers are going to be all that relevant in general, and whether or not other sources of news should be included. Now, in terms of, as you can already imagine, when it comes to negativity, I'm very worried about using information sources like Twitter or other things to try to elicit a news from, because that will have a degree of negativity that will even beat the most negative data points that we have by the end of our newspaper reporting. And so I think in general, this question of what are reliable news sources in today's world and where would you get your news from is not something that we are going to provide an answer to. The paper that we're presenting here is mainly an historical analysis of what local newspaper sentiment can tell us about national and local economic growth numbers. But and there is an interesting discussion to be had from where to go from here going forward. All right, so we're going to follow 3 broad steps. So first, create a dictionary of relevant words for the topic. So we have certain seed words that we're going to use for the economics topics, and we have certain seed words that we're going to use for general news. And then we identify the words that are positive or negative, and then we're going to apply this to measure the intensity of positive and negative sentiment in a particular document. we will be able to analyze things at the page level rather than at the article level, but we're still going to be measuring the overall tone of the reporting on these particular pages. Now, these words, I'll show them to you in a little bit, but there's nothing surprising about these seed words, and I'm pretty sure they're pretty uncontroversial. So we are then going to use Word2Vec, as I already said earlier. Using, say, a BERT or large language models is not yet possible, but my expectation is that it wouldn't make that much of a difference given the simple positivity or negativity of the document that we're really after in our particular measure. For more advanced applications, I'm sure that large language models might be a fantastic thing to use on this particular database once it becomes computationally feasible to do that. Okay, and so what Word2Vec really does is get these vector representations for words and then use the cosine similarity to try to measure the distance between words. And so that is the technique that we're also using here, right? Let me skip this for now. So here you see the few seed words related to sentiment from an economic point of view. So the positive words are things like expansion, boom, growth, profit, optimistic, optimism, opportunity, success, successful, and so forth. And a negative, we have recession, bankrupt, shrinking, unemployment, loss, bankruptcy, layoff, and so forth, right? So again, I think that these sorts of seed words are relatively straightforward. Another thing that we were concerned about was the extent to which over time maybe different words would be used to be optimistic or pessimistic about things. And actually, you know, even if you go back to, just for the fun of it, I did this, if you go back to the Wealth of Nations and you just look at the way that economic activity or other things are being described and what sorts of words are being used to describe good things and bad things, you'd be surprised how similar those words are. Of course, to a large extent, because that early literature is essentially what defined our field today, also in terms of the terminology that we use. So we did some analysis to try to think about this, but it's not something at this point that I'm particularly worried about, this similarity over time. Okay, so we said all of this. So then we're going to get a vector representation of the document. And then what we're going to do is we're going to separate the information that we have in two types of pages. So we have pages where economic news is being covered, and we have pages where general news is being covered. And so that allows us to get to sentiment measures that can be different for these economic page news pages as compared to the ones that describe general news, so that we can also see whether or not the overall negativity that we see evolving over time is something that is particular to the economy. It's, for example, possible, particularly in the last 50 years, that due to the secular stagnation period that we've seen since the 70s, that a secular downward trend in economic news reporting might actually be warranted. Or it could be that the negativity that general reporting is exhibiting is just making itself into the way that economic news is being reported as well. And so I think it's important to try to separate these two things. And so then we can, in principle, measure things at various levels of granularity. We are going to be focusing in the paper right now on the state and the country level. And we are also going to be seasonally adjusting the measure as well as the GDP growth. So, so what are the key advantages? Well, I think it's in terms of the data availability that we're getting, I think the biggest selling point of the paper is that it has this long time series and this cross section. And I also think that the method that we're using right now is going to be well able to capture levels of sentiment based on the methods. So the method that we have reflects the context in which the words and the phrases are used. It automatically deals with negation. It has also a continuous scale, which I think is important. So it's not just a +1, -1 sort of thing, but there is a continuous scale in terms of how positive something is. All right, so let's get down to the results. So first, Let me see, how much time do I have? I have, the intro was 5 minutes, Andy, so I have about maybe 15 minutes left, or that won't work. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, so first, here you see our quarterly measure of raw economic sentiment for 170 years. And so a couple things that are important to take away from this picture, and something that many people, I don't think, appreciate. First of all, look at the incidence of the gray bars between 1850 and say 1930 versus the incidence of the gray bars after. So that's just an indication of how less common recessions have been in the last part of our sample compared to the first part of the sample. So those are those shaded areas. Secondly, look at the line itself. You see very large variation in the sentiment. And also, it happens in certain cases at places where you would exactly expect it to happen. So for example, the Great Depression is very clearly visible in the 1930s. And so you see there that economic sentiment takes a big dive. We're also seeing that the Great Recession, that you see there, a big dive. We see that the busting of the dot-com bubble, we see there that the series goes down by a lot. There are also some, at least to me, some more surprising things that were happening. So for example, if you look at the period of the Second World War, you see that generally speaking, the positivity about news is going up, right? So you see there that reporting is positive. Now, of course, there are two possible reasons for that. The first one is it may be the case that the war efforts actually had a positive influence due to spending on economic activity in the United States. That's one. Another possible explanation, of course, is that over this period of time, it was expected that newspapers were positive about the outlook and about the war situation. So this again goes a little bit back into this question of, are we capturing, if you look at a series like this, which is the raw economic sentiment measure, are we capturing things that are specific to economics, or are we potentially also capturing general positivity or negativity in our series? And so what we can then do is we can just look at the pages in which economic news is not reported, and then take a look at what the non-economic pages in terms of sentiment actually look like. And so I think that is the red line that you see here. And again, there are a couple of interesting things to note. One thing particularly, of course, that is to some extent disturbing is that from the mid-70s onwards, we see this very strong trend downwards. Both the blue and the red line essentially have their lowest point in the last couple of years. I think that the blue line literally has it at the end of the sample, and the red line is close to the lowest point that we're seeing over the entire sample. So the question is, why has both economic and non-economic news reporting turned so incredibly negative? And so many journalists have contacted us to talk about the paper, and most of them are mainly interested in asking that question, and they also want to have us take a stance on what we think that is. Of course, in the paper, we are not testing a theory or showing empirical evidence of what theory best supports it, but a theory that is consistent with the data that we're seeing is that if bad news sells and the competitive pressure on newspapers has gone up also due to the emergence of alternatives, and then of course more and more negative reporting could be an explanation for what we're seeing. I do think that separate research into exactly that question seems important. And so follow-up research into this question, I think, is first order to try to figure that out. Now, if we have these two measures, then one thing that we can do is orthogonalize one with respect to the other, so that we get an economic news-based series that is that is not affected by the trends that you see, and then you get this series over here. Okay, so I have 10 minutes left. So first, here you see the relationship between the Michigan survey and our net, so the orthogonalized version of the economic sentiment. And so what you can see is that there is quite a high correlation. It has 71% correlation, but also I think that there's some places where we have interesting deviations from it, including, of course, the end of the sample, right? So you see there that the Michigan survey is substantially more negative than the net economic sentiment measure that we have here. Now, there's also substantial variation in local sentiment. So here, for example, you see the individual state time series, and one for California and one for New York. And you can see that that there's a big difference there. Also, the where exactly they peak, but more generally, we can just see what the national trend explains of the cross-sectional variation of each of the individual states. And as I already said earlier, that is only 35%, right? So here you see a whole bunch of different states, and there's a lot of variation going on. And that is not shared. That's not the common, the national sort of thing. But also, one thing that is interesting is that the downward trend, while the shocks downward may happen at different points in time, is something that seems to be shared across multiple states, right? So it's not the case that this negative trend that we're seeing in the raw economic sentiment or in the non-economic news-based measures is something that is driven by one particular state. This negativity seems to be shared across multiple states. All right. So very quickly, just so that we go through the results, I will not go into much detail for each of them. The first one is the changes in sentiment have predictive power for GDP growth, and even when we include several other predictors, particularly I think lagged GDP growth is important, as well as the term spread. And you can see that our measure survives that. We run the analysis for multiple subsets of the data. We run it for quarterly data, which is the table that we're currently looking at, but we're also going to, which is quarterly data between 47 and 2019 Q4, but we're also going to be running it for annual data, because obviously the GDP data isn't the high quality GDP data is not available in the very early part of our sample. And so for annual data, we also find the same predictability of the sentiment. So, and that's this one over here. And now one other thing that is important is that due to what some people, of course, at the end of the sample, this is a little less, but I do think that particularly in the context of this early part of the sample where you saw these very prolonged recessions, the amount of GDP growth variation and therefore the severity of recessions is obviously different in different parts of the sample. And so if we look at the coefficient estimates that we're getting, it should not be too surprising that these coefficient estimates might be different at different points in time. Now, another thing that we can do based on the text-based measure that we have is that we can separate news about the present from news about the future. And so if we really believe that our sentiment measure has predictive power, then it should be statements about the future that have the predictive power. And that is indeed something that we can confirm as well. Okay, so I'm going to skip this for now. Another important one that I think deserves attention is this, and that dives a little bit deeper into the question of, is our paper just a rational expectations confirming exercise where people are just optimally adjusting expectations about future GDP growth, and that the sentiment that we're seeing in the newspaper and you aggregate that is simply a better reflection of the true rational expectations of the consumers or agents in the model that we look at? Or is there something behavioral about this as well? And so at a minimum, what we can say is that the fact that our measure has additional predictive power over and above what analyst forecasts are predicting, and the fact that our sentiment measure seems to lead their forecasts, that, at least from the perspective of the analysts, does not seem to be consistent with a rational expectations type explanation, right? So if this news is in fact in their information set, then they should have already adjusted their forecasts, and so that should already be reflected in that. Finally, so we're going to be running a bunch of different specifications for the Taylor rule, and we're going to ask the question, does the sentiment measure that we have derived have any predictive power for Fed policy. And we do, in fact, find that a 1 standard deviation decrease in our economic sentiment measure is about equal on the downside, equal to one extra move in one extra rate cut of 25 basis points. So I think that's nothing to sneeze at. So there's also something interesting there. Now, there's still a bit of a question whether or not it's possible that our sentiment measure, because it has GDP predictive power, could maybe influence expectations in that way, and that that through that channel it might make itself into the Fed's rate setting, or it could just be that the Fed itself is being influenced by the sentiment that is being reported in the news and therefore adjusts rates accordingly. So I think there's something interesting there as well. Finally, so if we do a decomposition of GDP, right, we can think of it as the income that accrues to labor and the income that accrues to capital, and because those are the two main inputs here. And the question is, well, if we have predictive power, is this a labor channel or is this a capital channel? And I think that the results that we're currently having in the paper are mostly consistent with the sentiment working through the labor market channel, not through the capital market, the capital channel. And so it does seem to be that that employment and hiring is being affected through the sentiment measure rather than the capital investment side of the firms. As I already said earlier, alluded to earlier, there's also this question of does our measure predict stock returns? A lot of finance people, that's the first question that they ask. We do not find much either for inflation or for stock return predictability. We mainly find predictability of sentiment on fundamentals, so GDP, and particularly through the labor channel. All right. So let me conclude. So I think that this is a first paper that says, let's just use a very large corpus of local newspapers to try to back out a sentiment measure, which simply measures how positive or negative news is. We can separate economic news from non-economic news, and that way we can construct these very long time series at the state level of economic sentiment. We find that this sentiment measure has very large variation, both in the time series and in the cross-section. We find that this sentiment measure has predictive power for GDP. One result that I haven't shown you yet, or two results related to the state level evidence that we have, is as follows. The first one is that we find that local sentiment at the state level predicts local GDP growth. So it's not just that national sentiment predicts national GDP growth, but it's also a result that holds at the state level. So that's one. Two, we find that the dispersion in the sentiment has predictive power for aggregate GDP growth. So large dispersion means lower GDP growth going forward. We find that the sentiment measure both has implications for predicting monetary policy, as well as predicting the forecast of the survey professional forecasters. And so the fact that our sentiment measure leads that, I think is an interesting thing to think about, what that implies about at least the rational expectations of the analysts in our sample. So we have a bunch of things that we're currently working on and improving in response to the referee, but hopefully we'll have more results to show you in that sense. So thank you very much. I think I'm 1 minute short, so I'm even 1 minute early. So thank you so much. And again, Baozhong, thank you so much for discussing the paper.
Thank you so much, Jules, for this fantastic talk. So Baozhong is now discussing the paper.
Can you see my screen? Great. First of all, thanks Andy and the organizers a lot for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. Yeah, I really enjoy reading the paper and I learned a lot from it. So let me first start about what this paper does. Jules, of course, has summarized the paper very well, right? So I will be very brief on this. So there are tons of amazing things about the paper. The first really impressive thing is the expensive data of news articles in their data set in the US since 1850, a very early period. And their data contains about 1 billion articles from 13,000 local newspapers. Very impressive. And it's really fit the big data theme of this forum. Um, Now, equipped with this large data, Jules and the co-authors designed our new measure of economic sentiment. It's quite interesting. First of all, they define economic dictionaries constructed from word embedding approach, right? Basically, from economic seed words, you construct synonyms based on word embedding technology, and the collection of all synonyms form the economic dictionaries based on my understanding. And in addition to that, they construct continuous sentiment measure assigned to different phrases. So a positive word, the really positive word can have a sentiment of one, right? A really negative word can have a sentiment of negative one, right? And something neutral will have near zero. Basically there's a continuous spectrum. I think that's an innovation not seen much in the finance literature because most dictionaries assign either positive or negative, right? A binary classification, not a continuous measure. So this could add some nuance to the sentiment. And based on these sentiment and economic dictionaries, they constructed a a measure of economic sentiment. There are more detailed processes. For example, they need to construct a vector based on the uh, each page of the file, right? And then calculate the similarity between that vector and the sentiment weighted vector of the dictionaries. And the correlation is defined as the economic sentiment of that page. So there's a lot of design there. But in the end, when they constructed the national measure, economic measure, it's strongly correlated with the Michigan consumer survey responses. So I think that's a strong validation of their measure, right? It makes sense. And also the dictionaries look fine. Now, this new economic sentiment measure actually can they did a bunch of tests about it. Maybe the most important test is that it is a forecaster of future GDP growth. Now, this measure can be defined at the national and the state level and even finer levels based on their data. That's a large advantage. And also, interestingly, they can separate the economic sentiment from the non-economic sentiment. Um, and I think that that's also sort of a validation of their measure, right? Because economic sentiment should matter more for GDP growth and economic cycles. And it seems to be the case here in the plot. Uh, the blue line actually shows a better predictive power for the economic cycles. Although in general they have a similar trend, like long run trend. And they also show that it's the sentiment about future events that matters, not current events. So it's more about expectations about the future, or belief about the future, or information about the future, right? So, and finally, if the economic sentiment can forecast future GDP growth, where does that predictive power come from? So they decompose GDP into different components, and they find most of the power comes from employment and consumption and the services. And this potentially can have a lot of impact. For example, if this sentiment can forecast GDP growth, that can potentially also influence the Federal Reserve's monetary policies, right? Either from the information contained in there, and or maybe the Federal Reserve can be influenced by the sentiment only, right? As Jules already mentioned in the discussion. Now, what I like about the paper, and there's a lot of new stuff in the paper, which I like a lot. First of all, the data set is really unique. Uh, It's the first time I see it in finance literature. It's a very rich new data with a very long time series and a very large spatial dimension. So it's large both in the time series and the cross section. That data actually later I will comment may have further uses. Right? It could provide a rich opportunity for researchers for other purposes. Now, these new they constructed a new economic sentiment measure. This is a largely automatic process. That's very nice. This measure could be used to backfill consumer sentiment or general sentiment in the market that could be used for historical studies. And it also leads to granular sentiment at the state level or even finer levels that could be useful for decisions. For example, state decision makers. Now, this they also through a bunch of tests, they show that the sentiment contains new information relevant for business cycles beyond those in the historical data, the survey of professional forecasters, and this could be useful for economists and regulators. Overall, I think this is a very nice paper and well executed with a lot of innovations and important implications. So it's already well presented, including being presented at GSU, right? When we have the FinTech conference. So I already learned about this paper at that time. Oh, it's a quite polished paper already. So I'm not sure how many new comments can I provide. So first of all, I'm going to take a step back and look at the literature on textual analysis, the NLP, right, natural language processing, especially from a methodology point of view, because I think that's a key part of this paper, right? They invented a new methodology. So textual analysis has been there in finance has been there for almost 20 years. One of the earliest papers is the Petrov paper, and this so at the beginning, the method is all dictionary based, right? Humans define a set of dictionaries, either about sentiment or about forward-looking terms or risk-related words, right? Even now, we're still using many dictionaries in some analysis. And this has the advantage that that basically or it's quite transparent, right? We can see all the dictionaries and also it's a expert curated. Now, going forward, there are many studies that use word-based methods, uh, like machine learning models, for example, built on bag of words. I'm sorry, just 1 second. Built on a bag of words, like the collection of all the words in the document. You can build models of machine learning, right, to predict, for example, job returns or like a patent classification or other things, right? The topics of the topic discussed in the paper and so on. And that's one class. Then come word embeddings. Those word embeddings convert words to vectors. And so this conversion utilize the context of word within the document. Right? It's sort of word to vec used by the authors. Mostly, it's based on the methodology invented by Google. Uh, and this already is kind of like between word and sentence, right? It's something in between. No? Then come the large language models, right? The BERT invented by Google in 2018, right? And the BERT and other large language models convert text to vectors, and these vectors can be used in various machine learning models. And finally, we see the generative AI approach, right? As in ChatGPT and other stuff. And because of the power of generative AI, we can directly prompt them specific questions. For example, in one of my paper, we query conference calls to get managerial expectations on investment policies specifically, and they're like it's rapidly growing literature on this. Now, if you list the 5 categories here from top to bottom, they go from being more transparent to being more black box, right? And at the top is all human determined. Right? At the bottom is very advanced AI, generative AI is all automatic and very complex. So whenever you choose approach, there will be a like trade-off between the performance and complexity, right? Power and interpretability, right? I think that there's a tension here. We are now going more and more toward the bottom, right? Because when we have the more advanced model, we want to use them. But at the same time, we want to also keep in mind the really advanced models is harder to interpret, right? Uh, and that's something we want to keep in mind. This paper strikes somewhere in the middle, as Jules mentioned, because of the feasibility, right? The computational limitation. They choose one method using word embeddings and a dictionary-based method, and that seemed to work pretty well. One comment about methodology. When they construct the sentiment measure, they start with a set of 10 positive words and 10 negative seed words, and then use word embedding and send prop to assign continuous score in each word in the dictionary. I think this process is mostly automatic, but there's still some subjective human choice, including the initial seed word, right? And I'm not sure how important that is, but maybe you can look at it because uh, one one potential issue is that some words actually could have neutral meanings like profit, profitability, growth, or unemployment. You could have a positive profit or negative profit, right? You could have a great growth or lukewarm growth. So I see that there could be different interpretations of these seed words, and that could affect the result. So once humans make a decision, how do you determine which word are most negative or most positive? That's one issue, right? Because you are going to assign a continuous score, and so the starting seed word may matter a lot, right? Whether they are at the two end of the spectrum. And how do you determine non-economic positive and negative word? It's not given in the paper, but I assume there will be a similar approach where you give like a list of positive and negative C words. And regarding this point, actually, I'm thinking whether it's possible to combine the GPT or generative AI to help define the seed word list, right? Maybe the AI can help you to screen out the most negative words and most positive words, and that will be an automatic process, right? You don't have to rely on humans to determine which words are going to be included in the seed word list. Another possibility is that you can use generative AI to validate the dictionaries you generate, right? It's maybe infeasible to use generative AI for the whole thing, right? But maybe just for the dictionaries, it's possible. Right? You have a few thousand words. Use generative AI to evaluate how positive each word is and how negative each word is, and compare with your definition. If they are very similar, then that give you a further validation of the approach. And about the data, I think the data is great. Right? Data, you have expensive new data. Actually, in the era of AI, data is the oil. It's a prime importance. And the quality of data also matters a lot for AI training. We know garbage in, garbage out, right? So the quality may be important. You have a lot of newspapers. I'm thinking they could have a lot of variation in their impact and quality. Some like small newspaper in like a neighborhood may not be as impactful as a large national newspaper. So could you like consider a weighted measure, right, based on the circulation of newspapers or the impact of the newspaper? I don't know how you can do that, but definitely there should be some variation between national newspaper and the state newspapers. When you construct the measure, maybe more weight can be put on the influential national newspapers, right? Rather than very small local newspapers. And this data can potentially offer a lot more insight on different issues, right? Like politics, culture, uh, and other stuff, right? And that some of them may not be directly in finance, but I think they're very important topics you can study with this paper, probably in uh, uh, different papers. But this data seem to be very amazing. Now, another question about the sentiment measure is that what does this measure really capture? Does it reflect fundamental information or beliefs? I understand your paper does not take a stand on this because it could be very hard to disentangle them. Um, but I think maybe more evidence or tests could be helpful for us. For example, some of the words are more related to fundamentals like loss, profit, default, and some other words are more related to beliefs like optimism, mistake, or pessimistic. Could it be possible to separate the word list into more objective words versus more like subjective words, right? That could be one way to separate the sentiment measure into more fundamental information versus beliefs. Uh, and also, the there's some evidence suggesting this could contain at least a belief component. If these are beliefs, whose beliefs are these about? Consumers, investors, or reporters? Right? Your mayor is highly correlated with the Michigan Consumer Survey, so it could be reflecting consumer preference, but it could also be from just a reporter's sentiment, right? Because they are summarizing information, right? They have a personal belief that are being put into the news report. And there could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? When the news reporter write the market is bad, and people now all believe the market will be bad, and the selling stops. Then the market became bad, really. Um, so could there be a behavior pattern like in market trading, right? I'm just wondering whether you can test that, right? Because we know news media do drive stock market returns. So that could be something you can test the story, right? But it's not the main part of your paper, but some additional evidence could be helpful for us to understand more about what really does the sentiment means. And I also have some comments about the economic mechanism. Uh, in your test, you find that mostly the predictive power comes from employment and consumption part, not from investment and production. Now, I'm wondering why that is the case, right? Why newspaper sentiment only predict employment and consumption well? Could it be that some newspapers focus more on employment and consumption topics? Maybe some local newspaper really care more about local employment or consumption behavior? Uh, Maybe you can study like the topics covered by newspapers, right? And try to see whether that's the case. Uh, and maybe the readers of the local newspapers are mostly consumers, and their behavior are influenced by those newspapers, right? That is again a feedback loop here. Uh, and maybe for that you can try to differentiate the effect of national and local newspapers. Maybe they have a different impact. Right? Maybe the national newspapers can predict investment or production. I don't know, but there could be something to think about. But overall, I think this is a very nice paper, well written, with very nice data method and empirical analysis, with a lot of innovations and implications. Some further refinement will make this paper even better. I highly recommend everyone to read the paper and wish you good luck in the publication process. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Baozhong. So we now have some time for questions from the audience, but let's first give our speakers a big round of virtual applause. And please stay in the Zoom room when we upgrade everyone to panelists so that we can get to the questions. And Jules, you can, of course, also take some time to respond to the discussion.
Well, I just mainly wanted to say with respect to the discussion, thank you so much. Fantastic discussion. You gave us a few things to think about, which I think are important. I think that the seed words for the general, we should just put them in the paper, but there are things like good, lovely, excellent, fortunate, and pleasant, and the bad ones are bad, horrible, poor, unfortunate, and unpleasant. So it's hard, you know, they're sort of the usual suspects in terms of I'm getting that. With respect to, and I saw a few questions in the chat as well. I mean, it is a continuous measure, right? So once you say that unemployment is a bad word, that means that high unemployment means that that's worse than unemployment, and meaning that employment is the good part of it, right? So I think that I'm not sure it fully takes care of the issue that you raised, which I'm sympathetic to, that there are certain words that may be more neutral than we had realized. But as long as the direction is right, then the scale will adjust also in the similarity with other words that we're thinking about. So I think we're fine there, but we will make sure to think about that more carefully. So Svetlana, did I miss anything that we should respond to? It's all good. Yep.
Okay, so we have a number of questions in the Q&A, and I think it's probably easiest to start with Roxana, who had a number of questions. So she doesn't seem to be sort of in the Zoom room yet. So I think the questions are sort of well posed. So maybe Jules, can you see the? Oh, here she is. So maybe she can sort of directly ask them, and that'll be easier.
Hi, Roxana.
Hi, Jules. Hi, Svetlana. Hi, everyone. So I had a couple of questions, but I don't think I have time to go over all of them. So I'll go to the one that I think is most interesting, which is whether you can separate expectations, like beliefs, from the uncertainty component. Because when we think about new information, we think about the quality of that signal, and then I guess some newspapers, they are more uncertain there than others, or just the language could be more uncertain. Is that part of the index that you compute? And if not, can you account for it? Do you need to run the algorithm to create an uncertainty index, if that was a question of interest?
I like that a lot, that question. I think it's a great question. So in some sense, the continuous measure is going to pick up some of what you're after, in the sense that if definitive strong statements are made, right, you can think of those as being communicated with very little uncertainty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but in general, you know, the idea that as a proper Bayesian, we would weight each data point with the implicit uncertainty with which it's communicated. Obviously, that's something that I'm completely on board with. And that there could be time variation in uncertainty that might have important predictive power.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great thing to dive into. I'm not sure. Question is whether this paper would be the right place to do that, or whether in general this method can indeed be applied to go directly after uncertainty measures. I mean, particularly given the recent rise in sort of also Sidney Ludvigson's work, where we're thinking about principal components of all kinds of different uncertainty measures. If it's possible to construct uncertainty measures based on text, I think that would be fantastic. So thank you for that suggestion. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for the answer.